I cried unto thee, save me, and I shall keep thy testimonies. I prevented the dawning of the morning. I cried, I hoped in thy word. Mine eyes prevent the night watches, that I might meditate in thy word. Hear my voice according to thy loving kindness, O Lord. Quicken me according to thy judgment. They draw nigh that follow after mischief.
Hello, good morning. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. We are continuing in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. We're just about the end of this chapter. And of course, it's always worth remembering that there are no chapter divisions in the original writings. And so very often you don't get a major shift in subject from chapter to chapter. In fact, really, if you think about it from the beginning of the letter, we've been in a continual flow of ideas from Paul. He uses himself in that, but it's not obvious that actually he had anything to do with it. As far as, he says, I've transferred these things in a figure to myself and Apollos, because there were other people who were the, sort of to, I guess, avoid naming them, perhaps. And he chastised them for going to law against one another, and for tolerating a man who was living in fornication with his father's wife. And so on, and so we get here to verse 18. And that's the sort of thing that survives the divorce. You know what I mean? Even after a divorce. Because Jesus himself taught that when you divorce a woman, saving for a just cause, which, and the example he used was fornication, which was if you expected a virgin and it turned out she wasn't one, that was the Lord himself considered that grounds for divorce, certainly in their culture. And I would say the same to anyone today. If a girl presented herself as having kept herself chaste through her youth, and then it turned out that wasn't true, that's grounds for divorce, because it's misrepresentation. And so is adultery and other severe things. And also, of course, as a Christian, if the unbelieving wish to depart, Paul says we can allow them to go. So, but even after a divorce, you can't sleep with your stepmother. It's just absolutely unacceptable. So flee fornication. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body. And hold on. But he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? Now, every sin that a man doeth is without the body. Now, that's sort of like, I think I understand what he means. Well, you could, but, you could say that when he's saying this, he's speaking generally. Meaning, it doesn't mean that, like, your body isn't involved in any other sin. Or that there are no other sins which one can commit against your body, meaning that your body suffers because of the sins. But the only thing I can think that separates fornication from every other sin, and with fornication, adultery is just a more severe form of fornication. That's why when Jesus said, whoever shall put away with his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, he says fornication because specifically that covers from everything from premarital sex to adultery. You can commit fornication without committing adultery, but you can't commit adultery without fornicating. So he sinneth against his own body. And that, in the specific sense in which that is as he said, "Know ye not, and he which is joined to an harlot is one body." It's only sin in which your body is unified and becomes one with someone else in sin. I mean, like, you make yourself one with an harlot or with another person who, to whom you are not committed in marriage. You're making yourself one with them. So, like I said, if someone like engages in that and then they go on to be married, that covers the sin as far as I'm concerned. It's like, because that's, if you look at the Old Testament, very often that is the penalty for fornication, is they're enforced to be married. I put more blockers. The sun's like right in my eye. All right, so hopefully I'll go up just a bit more. So I have all these shades on my thing and just that one spot I missed. Okay, so know ye not that your body is a temple of the Holy Ghost? Well, which is in you, which ye have of God, for you are not your own. And that is how you sin against your body, is because you're using your body in a way that defiles that which is the temple of the Holy Ghost, in a way that is explicitly unique from other sins. And that, yes, why would you say it is unique in the way it is unique? When you steal, you use your body to steal. But the sinful act is done externally. Even murder is done externally. Though, it is a crime of the internal as far as the mind. But the body itself is a unique participant in this in a way that no other sin is what he's saying. So your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost. Your body is the members of Christ. It said, shall I make the members of Christ the members of an harlot? The pieces, the parts of Christ, You have this Holy Spirit of God, and you don't belong to yourself. You may not give yourself freely to someone else. People oftentimes, when they find the Lord, maybe they had been fornicators. They had lived a life of sin. And then when they find the Lord, very many of them often, even instinctively, understand that they have to change their behavior. They can't live their life as they had been living it. They can't engage in the behaviors they had been engaging in. So they stop. And this is the exact right response. Because God has called you to something higher. And the only way you should engage in that kind of behavior again is if you're married. You are bought with a price. I mean, the idea of Jesus, people say, well, I believe in Jesus. The whole point of Jesus is he laid his life down, he shed his blood to pay for our sins. And that payment is a form of redemption. So we're condemned, and by his sacrifice, he redeems us from the death that we so richly deserve. And therefore, it's like we have been purchased, like slaves. And a slave may not do whatever he wills, but must yield their will to their master. And that is very much the relationship we have with God. Not only he has come and dwells in us in the form of his Spirit, but he does not dwell in us, in a way, as I said, that you feel this overwhelming sense of his presence at all times. Because part of what we learn is to God does not want us to be righteous merely because we fear that he is over our shoulder at every moment, but rather because we now know what the right thing to do is. And if we can do the right thing for the right thing's sake, that is a greater righteousness than merely doing it for fear of the thought that he is there and ready to punish. And in fact, as Christians, God is dealing with us on the basis of grace. Therefore, our fear towards him is not measured on the scale of fear of punishment, but there is the fear and respect of the power of who he is and what our relationship is to him, that he is our God, and therefore we owe him our allegiance and our obedience. We owe him our obedience. That is right. It's not because we expect punishment, but because we know we are expected to obey. Yeah, and as a Christian, I don't live in expectation of God's punishment. I live in expectation of what I ought to do to conform to his will. That's what I'm expecting. It's like, I'm going to modify my behavior to please the Lord. And that's what the future holds, not punishments from God. It's not a properly Christian mindset. Yeah, I mean, a properly Christian mindset is not, a certain fearful looking for of judgment. The properly Christian mindset is the expectation of grace for sins past and the expectation of obedience for the fact of having God's Spirit dwelling in me. So we are bought with a price. There has been a heavy price paid to purchase us. He paid his life. We put our faith in him. He receives us, and on those terms we become his servants. And therefore we ought to glorify God in our bodies. Our bodies are the temples of the Lord in which he ought to be glorified. He ought to be magnified. God should be, like in the example of our lives and our behavior, like anyone looking into that should see that God is great, that God is glorified. We obey God through our obedience. I mean, we glorify God through our obedience, in a sense, because he has glory in that he is able to move us and shape us into his image, which is then seen by men. And it is seen as a light, as a righteous example, as a righteous standard by which the world can be judged. So glorify God in your body. Be better. Don't be a fornicator. In your body and in your spirit, which are God's. We belong, body and spirit, to God. And we don't belong to ourselves anymore. Let's go on to chapter 7. Which seems like a shift in topic, but not really, as you will see. It's a minor shift of focus. Now, concerning the things whereof he wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife to the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. I speak this by permission, not of commandment. For I would that all men were as myself, even as I myself. But every man hath the proper gift of God, one after this matter, and another after that. Okay, let's just hold there. He's going to go to the unmarried widows and all that. And I just went way too far back suddenly and unexpectedly. Okay, so now he talks about married couples. And this is the thing that... And what are the things that they wrote about? And I think it was something about celibacy, probably. And also probably about sex. Because he addresses it right there. You know, and I'll go over the details of it. But, you know, it seems like, people, and you look at it in the Catholic Church, you know, they've enshrined celibacy in their entire priesthood. That means to even serve God, they made it mandatory that on some level, to serve Him at certain levels, you can't be married. You know, and I think that's absolutely wrong. Paul preferred to stay unmarried, and he's admitted that he would love everyone else to be like him. Because I understand the attraction. You know, when I was in college, I was only really at the university. I was at the University of Illinois for 1 year, which I completely just wasted that time. As far as I didn't really, I spent a lot of time in the weight room. That's about it. And I attended a class or two, got a credit or two, you know. But I didn't do much really as far as academically. But when I started realizing that, you know, what I really wanted to do was serve God as the primary focus of my life, let's say. Even as a career path at the time. I was still trying to understand my future in terms of a career. I remember telling people I wanted to join the priesthood. Because it seemed like that's how you give yourself wholly to God, right? And you don't have a wife, you just completely give yourself over to the service of God. I remember my wife told me once, or she told me several times, but she told me that at one point she tried to become a nun. Because that just seemed like, you know, oh, I want to serve God. So I'll go become a nun. And live a celibate, single life. You know, among other people who are all celibate and single and presumably focused on God. And, you know, as a young person, I didn't really know, like, that's what seemed to me the most extreme step. And it is. But, you know, oftentimes, even what do we have? Scandals, though. Scandals that are we have greater forms of fornication coming out of the priesthood. And, you know, it's not as scandalous, but nuns also can be guilty of incontinence. They don't absolutely maintain their celibacy, but in one form or another, some, you know, not saying any particular ratio, I don't know, but we know from the scandals that it happens among the priests, and it certainly happens among the women also. And so to avoid this, and so I remember a friend of mine said, yeah, I'd like to be a priest too, but I like women. And I remember I thought about it, I'm like, yeah, that is a problem. That is a problem, because I wanted to be a priest and serve God, but I hadn't really, you know, to swear off women for the rest of your life. It's quite a big step at 19, which is how old I was. And even then I kind of knew I wasn't ready for that. And so as I started, I realized I would find a proper wife. And I would set about, I figured I could just, previously, you know, and this is an important thing about marriage, and I say this a lot, but young people who are thinking about getting married, when I was a young person, my first criteria, in high school stuff, was whether or not a girl was attractive. And there was certain attractive girls that were like all potential candidates, like maybe I'd like to date them, right? And I'm not saying that I honestly ever considered anyone who wasn't attractive, but it was like my first thought and my first focus. And then from all of them, it was like the only question was, do they like me? Do they like me? And then if one of them likes me, immediately I would be willing to start dating them. And that's such a stupid standard. Because I've done nothing other than determine that they are attractive, which as you get older, you realize that like 90% of young people are. So, you know what I mean? Like that's absolutely a way too broad a brush with which to paint people in terms of their attraction to you. And whether or not they like you, all that does is put you on a path of trying to make someone like you. Like if you find someone attractive, maybe you're just hanging around them, right? Maybe you work together. And you like them. So what do? You try to make them like you. You try to be funny, you try to be cool, you try to do all kinds of things to get them to notice you and to like you. And what a stupid thing to do. Because you have no idea what they're like. Why are we trying to cause people to be attracted to us who we know nothing about? And at least for my money, I was willing to date people just because I found them attractive and they liked me. That seems like really just absolutely zero standard. So if you're going to find a husband or a wife, you should think about, Paul's talking about in the context of believers. People who might want to go off and fast and such. And so I realized that had to be my first criteria. And I put it even ahead of attraction. I would consider anyone. But first and foremost, I want to know if they share with me the same dedication to the Lord. And the kind of dedication that's just about willing to go become a priest and become celibate for the rest of their life, but realizes that may not be practical because it's a long life and it's a lonely, long life as a celibate individual. And also realizing that, you don't really want to be alone. You're not going to be able to contain yourself. You know what I mean? I'm not going to be able to contain myself. I'm not going to be able to stay single my entire life. I'm not going to want to. And so to avoid fornication, you should find a husband or a wife. But when you go about doing that, if you're young and single, you need to think about their commitment to the Lord. And I met Christian, so I started hanging around places where I could meet Christian girls, like youth groups and stuff. And I was a youth. I wasn't like some old guy. I was 19, hanging around with college youth groups, I would go to, I visited some churches and kind of attended their youth group meetings. And they definitely had some of them were more Christ-focused than others, but some of them definitely had like the feeling of like, this is like, I could feel myself being checked out. It was like I don't want to say a hookup place, but I remember feeling at this one church, I'm like, this feels like a meat market, and that I wasn't interested in. I was not interested in that. I wasn't interested, I know, it's like some of you might find me attractive and I might find some of you attractive, but that is not going to come into consideration. The first consideration is, and you need to make, first of all, you yourself must be committed to the Lord. If we're going to talk about marriage and love in a Christian context, you must have the utmost commitment first yourself to the cause of Christ. It doesn't, if you're a nominal Christian, I don't know, don't harass someone who's more committed with your overtures of love. because they don't need you. I mean, that's preferable. They're better off with someone who is committed. I realize many people are already in marriage relationships with people who are not as committed as they are. You've already committed. There's no, you don't sabotage that. Don't screw it up by just maintain your faith, be a good example, and who knows how you will affect them. I mean, God knows, despite my commitment, my wife has had to bear along with me at times because of the various difficulties I've gone through, So, I mean, though very committed. Because even if someone's committed, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be perfect. But their commitment to Christ in a serious and very deep way can be an anchor to secure your relationship for the remainder of your lives. So you end up not being divorced. So you have something around which you can orbit a center pole, like a gravity holding you locked in orbit, so to speak, around God. And if you're both locked in the same place, you can't help but your priorities and goals should synchronize to some degree. Well, you may have some disagreements. Everyone does. God knows everyone does. Has disagreements over this or that. That's going to happen no matter who you marry. But the primary focus of your life, if it's not the same, you will have a lot more problems. So that's important in selecting who you're going to marry. It's like, even if someone's not a believer, I mean, what is most important to you? Or if you're a nominal believer, what's most important to you? I don't know how many times I've heard of people. It's like they get married and then all of a sudden it's like, well, I want to have kids, but they don't. That was important to you and you didn't discuss it. It never came up. Like, oh, I really don't want to have children. Like my wife and I, oddly enough, even though we have 8 kids, we were like children. We were both like that. We were children. We were, when we got engaged, we were 20. We were still kids, essentially. The whole, you're adult at 18 is a pretty arbitrary thing, though some people are more adult than others at 18 for sure, and some are less. But in the overall scheme of things, in your early 20s, you're still more child than adult, sorry. And when you get to be 30, and then when you get to be 40, you'll really see how true that is. Especially when you encounter other people that same age period, and you realize, just getting starting in an endeavor does not make you a full-blown expert at it. Adulthood. So to avoid fornication, Paul is very, he didn't marry, and so his attitude is a little bit like condescending, I think. And he makes it very clear in other places, the marriage bed is holy and sanctified, and that's all cool. The point is, you don't have to maintain celibacy. You can be married. And certainly, avoiding fornication is a great reason to be married, as far as Paul is concerned. If you can't withhold yourself, if you're going to fornicate, he would much rather see you be married. And in the marriage, he is very careful to say in verse 3, look at, let the husband render unto his wife due benevolence. And that is, in my mind, I'm going to look up really quick and, whoa, too big. What is going on here? Oh, there we go. Let's see. We need chapter 7. Due benevolence. I want to see what Greek word the benevolence is. And I'm bringing that up. Okay. Benevolence. Eunoia. Goodwill. And the word due is actually a different word. It means to owe. The goodwill owed. it takes a bit of, it does, like, you know what, like rendering, especially for men, towards men, women have to understand they owe their husband a deal of goodwill. In spite of a lot of things that might be going on in your lives, there is a debt of goodwill which you owe. Remember, he's married to you. He's supposed to keep himself from other women, okay? And especially if you're married to an unbeliever, this is doubly so. And a woman who's married to a committed Christian at times could get away with being a bit, I don't know, difficult, let's say, about sex, which is what this is about, as far as I'm concerned. Because the goodwill rendered is the goodwill necessary to take your clothes off for him. You know, I mean that in a euphemistic sense. To make yourself available to him for sex. That's important. A lot of young women don't understand the degree to which young men will want that. And sometimes out of shame, they will not discuss how much they want it. But I can guarantee you it is at least daily, which may seem like a lot. It is a lot. And it does not always require, let's say, a full commitment to that. But some sort of, but the more affection you give your husband and the more you allow him to experience your goodwill in whatever form or the other, it will improve your relationship with him. And the husband also to the wife, let the husband render to his wife due benevolence, and the wife to the husband. The husband owes it to the wife as much as the wife to the husband. Especially as you get older. As you get older, men become less driven, let's say. And women change, and suddenly they become more driven. And I'll tell you, ladies, if you don't render him goodwill when you're young, he may be less inclined to render goodwill when you're old. And this is a stupid example, but you always remember in the sitcom from the early 80s or late 70s, whenever it was actually on, I always remember Mr. Roper and Mrs. Roper in Three's Company. This is a stupid thing, whatever. Maybe a lot of you are too young to remember, but she was this like kind of very horny older woman, and he was always like, ah. And the goodwill you sow will endear him to you for a long term. And so do not be stingy with your love, as far as I'm concerned. And Paul doesn't know a lot about this, but he does know this, that the wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband. Like in some sense, in this committed relationship, especially as Christians. I mean, I know that, like, I remember hearing about when they started talking about, rape in marriage relationships. No husband should have to force himself. That's terrible. No one should be forced. I never understood that myself. I was like to be welcomed to that situation. I was the whole kicking and screaming or whatever, or the silent resentment that might come from someone who was unwilling. I would think would be kind of like it would ruin the whole atmosphere. I like to be received on the basis of goodwill. You know what I mean? Let me be received, not rejected. Rejection is, for my money, so. But I mean, okay, that happens. But those guys are awfully frustrated, obviously, when they do that. And I do not condone it or excuse it, but on some level, we are all responsible for our relationships. Meaning, relationships are two-party things. There's a husband and a wife. It's a relationship between two people, and no situation arises entirely due to one person, as far as I'm concerned. Like, even if someone else is in the wrong, I could have done something to help them avoid that. As a committed partner, I could. There's always something I could do to help. I remember telling my wife at some point, like if she said something I didn't like, instead of taking offense, I could just tell her, what you mean to say is something like this, and tell her the way I think it ought to be said, in a way that is, because I know in my heart of hearts that everything she does, she means well. And because I know she intends well, because she's committed to Christ and to righteousness and to goodness and to our marriage. So why would she intentionally do anything to upset me? And why would I take offense? Why would I willingly take offense at anything done by someone who is so committed and loving? So, if we have the proper mindset between each other, those kind of situations shouldn't come up. And if you run to your husband or you run to your wife, do benevolence. This goes a long way to cementing a solid, close relationship. They say happy wife, happy life. Happy husband, happy life, too. You know what I mean? It's so like, in our modern society, everything's like so one-sided. In a lot of relationships, too, they want to make it one-sided. Because the man is supposed to be in charge, and we're supposed to be bigger and better and stronger and all that. At the same time, everyone wants to deny that men are bigger and better and stronger. You can't have it both ways. Either we are superior in the relationship, which is, I don't believe women generally marry men that they believe are beneath them. If they do, that's highly unusual. There's some level on which women look up to and admire the men they marry or they're in a relationship with, because they don't find lower status men attractive, especially when they're lower status than themselves. A woman may accept a man who's not the highest status man in town, right? Or in the world, of course, because otherwise everyone would be, all the women would only be attracted to the president. And no other world leader either, because the most powerful man in the world is only the most attractive. So that's not true. But if they feel you are of inferior moral or one can be less moral as a husband, but you can't be less in many other ways. Like you have to be superior in enough ways for them to find you attractive. And since you are, naturally the greater responsibility falls on you, and they tend to look to you to be better. More is expected of you, and it's quite a burden. And in the midst of that, I would not accept any sense of equality. It's like, if you want an equality, then stop expecting so much of me and expect every bit as much of yourself. And that never happens. That never happens. I've had people try to argue with me, my husband and I, we have a perfectly equal relationship, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't happen. It's that, all one has to do is scratch the surface just a bit and expose what's really going on. Because they'll use language that deceives and all that. I'm not going to get into it. I was thinking of this example of someone I talked to once, and I was like, and they were trying to make it seem like, so I let him do this, and I let him, really? I'm like, so he only does it because you allow it, huh? That's something that's going, only because he controls the finances because you allow it. It isn't because there's his actual power to, to render that properly has nothing to do with it. It's like, or whatever. Anyways, there are a lot of upside down situations too. And those are unhappy marriages. Promise you. And so, every wife wants her husband to step up. They don't like feeling like he is down. If you're a believer, step up. But on the other hand, like I said, but with the responsibility comes also the reward, as far as I'm concerned. As a woman, if you're expecting a lot of your husband, then he expects service from you. As Paul says, benevolence. If you want him to be a benevolent ruler in your life and take on the responsibilities that a male generally is supposed to take on, and to be strong and to support you and all these things, and to not, to be your shoulder to cry on and not to be crying on your shoulder, then you owe him much. I mean, and we have not, and the husband has not power over his own body, but the wife. I mean, what I was saying before about the like the husband has power over his wife's body, it goes the other way. And when I say it's unequal, I'm just saying everything has its reciprocal. What I'm saying is, like, often men are expected, much more is expected of men, but to the same degree they ought to receive greater respect for that in return. And as far as the man's body, he is not free to give himself to harlots. His body does not belong to him. It belongs to the wife. I mean, the pleasure he experiences, he should experience in company with her. I mean, he belongs to her, and she belongs to him. So their sexual life should be lived out together, because that is one of the primary reasons for marriage. It's in Paul's eyes. I'm not sure why you would get married, except to flee fornication is a really great reason. What he's saying is, like, he doesn't, he likes to abide the way he is. He sees it as he's free to go and do things, and to, he's not nailed down to a particular place with children and a wife, because oftentimes the inevitable consequence of marriage is children, and it certainly limits you. Now you can't just, like, Paul could literally just go places and work as a tent maker just to make enough to eat and support himself, and he was fine. It's not hard to support yourself only. I mean, I've struggled financially for years, but it's mostly because I have so many children. I mean, it's quite a number of people to take care of, and so it's quite a big bill. I mean, my grocery bill alone is immense. If it was just me, I mean, my Lord, I could easily, I'd have no problems at all. No problem at all. If it's just me, or just me and my wife. Two can live as cheaply as one. I remember when we were first married, I experienced that firsthand. It was great. Yeah, it was great. It was, wow, it was easy. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband likewise also the husband hath the power of his own body, by the wife. I mean, my body is not my own to do what I please with it. And so, I experience my pleasure with her, and also I owe her pleasure. I belong to her, and she belongs to me. Defraud not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again. Obviously, what is he talking about? He's saying that to withhold sex from your partner is a form of fraud. And it is a cruel thing to do. It's a great way to make up. It's a great way to resolve difficulties or disagreements. It's a great way to come back together and to reconcile to each other. It tends to smooth over ill feelings. It's a tool that is used well. He's saying don't defraud, except by consent, mutual consent. Like, let's give ourselves to fasting and prayer. If you're married to an unbeliever, that's not even an option. And then he says, if you want to somehow like say, okay, I really think celibacy is important to keep our minds focused on the Lord and not on the things above and not the things beneath. I think what it was is that, to a large degree, the Corinthians held Paul in a very high regard. And Christians for all ages have sort of been conflicted about sex. Because, fornication is a sin. And marriage is not. And it's sort of like, why is the commitment make what is a very, it's a very carnal thing. I mean, the body has several functions. It urinates, it defecates, and it procreates. And on some level, you think about it, we have profane words for urinate, piss. I don't consider that. That's not, when I was a kid, I said it and my mom was not happy with me. But it's in the Bible. But we say pee, but the piss. But whenever I talk about anything bathroom, right, it's all profane. Even the nice words. If I say poo-poo, that's sort of like cutesy, but it's still talking about the same profane thing than if I use like a more profane term. Same thing with intercourse. I'll use the medical term intercourse or do benevolence or goodwill or sex even. Sex is getting in more to the borderline. Then we have like the F word, which is considered very vulgar. In fact, it's even derived from the idea of fornication from something I heard. Like the F and I heard that it was an acronym and the first letter stood for fornication. Oh, no, it doesn't. It didn't. But it has something, but whatever. Or that the U stood for unlawful, right? Unlawful carnal knowledge, right? But I don't, that would be fornication. I don't know if that's actually the root or the origin of that word. But we consider it a highly profane word for the sexual act. But you notice that like the body's functions are all considered in some way profane. Meaning they're not holy. Profane means far from. Pro actually means in like you have the word. A lot of times people confuse the ideas of prescribe, like you get prescription, and proscribe, which means something is forbidden. It means you write a writing that says this is proscribed. You can't do this. And so the same thing with profane. It means it is something that is far from the temple, far from the place of worship, something that is unholy, like feces or intercourse. And in fact, in the Old Testament, after having intercourse, it was you were defiled ceremonially. Whenever a man's, people always may say, the Bible's so against women. It says when they're on their period, they're defiled. Well, blood was a defilement, and so was semen. If a man had a nocturnal emission, he was defiled. Why don't they ever mention that? Why is it always just, it's so against the ladies? It's against the men, too. At least women can predict their periods and take, if a guy's having nocturnal emissions, he has no idea when that's going to happen. They don't sell special, underwear liners for guys. So when you go to bed, it's that time of month, I'm going to have a nocturnal emission. I better put on my safety harness or whatever. There's no one cares. You know what I mean? It's funny. It's like there's no aisle in the grocery store for men's sanitary napkins or something. There's nothing. They got nothing for us, even though we are similarly defiled. It's not blood and all that, But in the Old Testament, it was unclean. If a man's seed went forth from him, he was defiled. And and if it went on for days, he would be defiled for days. Just because it doesn't go on for days like a menstrual period, it's like, anyways. So these functions are on some level defilements. And so, in the whole thing with the menstrual cycle and the intercourse and all that, it's sort of like, how can this be part of a holy life? You know, that's a question that people have asked for, and so they thought maybe to be close to God, we should just absolutely abstain from all those things. But I would say, can you abstain from using, from defecating? You can't. You will defile yourself through defecation, through urination. You're going to make defilements. You're going to make profane excrements and exude things from your body. You're going to menstruate if you're a woman. If you are completely celibate as a man, you're going to have a nocturnal emission eventually. Everyone is going to defile themselves in this way, at least in the most rudimentary sense, in the sense of the Old Testament law. And Paul is saying that, that the body's functions have a place, and marriage certainly is the proper venue for the reproductive function. And it's perfectly acceptable. And in fact, to avoid fornication, come together as often as necessary. Don't defraud each other. Don't withhold yourself from your husband or from your wife, lest they be tempted of the devil. Lest Satan tempt you because you are incontinent. Incontinence means, when we think of that, we think it's someone who pees in their pants. All right? And it's in this context, it's someone who they're sexually incontinent. They can't control themselves. They want sex. And, and you withhold sex from them for any period of time, you're tempting them to incontinence. Because the reason they're married is because they've desired a woman on some level, and they were good enough to commit to you, so be good enough to them. And I speak mostly of the men. I say, be good to him when he's young, and he'll be good to you when you're old. And you'll be glad of it. It can be a very long, lonely trip in middle age and older if you have a bitter, angry husband in your home. If you manage to stick around all those years, and you manage to punish him for every perceived slight by withholding from him that, there's nothing more embittering to a guy to be in a committed relationship where you're expected to be loyal, but you're not able to eat the fruits of your loyalty. You know what I mean? Like, you don't give him sex, and you still expect him to be loyal. Some people say, well, yeah. I say no. No. A committed Christian sure ought to be and ought to suffer it. But you make your spouse suffer. What kind of person makes their spouse suffer? What kind of spouse suffers them to be tempted in that way? You want Satan to tempt your husband? Is that what your goal is? I'm just saying. This I speak by permission. I'm not commanding you to abstain from sex so you can fast and pray. I'm saying that you can do that. That's what he's saying here. I speak this by permission, I'm not giving you a commandment Paul gives a commandment to fast and pray and to abstain from sex. People are so, they want to demonstrate their holiness. And like I said, it's easier when men and women are sometimes like ships in the night. When a man is young, he has a very strong and active desire, and women less so, not non-existent. But same thing as they get older, men have a lesser desire as the woman's increase, not non-existent. But if he's bitter, And I say this because I've seen bitter marriages, not mine, but others. I've seen it, and it's not pretty. Like I said, he may not want to talk about it, especially if he's a committed believer. He's not going to want to tell you or admit that he wants to have sex every day, and maybe more than once a day, or have some sort of sexual contact, or even oh, my husband's got a problem masturbating. Well, why aren't you there? Maybe he thinks you would think he was gross or something. You need to be part of his life. And I'll say that. There's all kinds of ways in which you can help your husband be faithful and make sure that you are part of his that you are rendering him the benevolence due. Goodwill. Extend your goodwill. I speak this of permission, not by commandment. And with it all men were as myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God after this manner. Saying, yes, I would like it if everyone was like me. He already just said he speaks by permission, not by commandment. I wish that all men were even as I myself. Everyone has their proper, it's not given to all people to be celibate and single. But to some it is. So everyone doesn't, that's another thing in Christianity, everyone doesn't have to be married. Some people can be content being unmarried. Stop trying to force everyone to get married. It's not for everybody. I would rather be single and miserable than married and miserable. Okay? It's great to be happily married. It sucks to be miserably married. It'd be better to be lonely and single. There's a lot of proverbs about stuff like that. Better to live on the corner of a house than with an angry and contentious woman. Glad I haven't had to suffer that. So we all have our proper gift of God. And this I say to the unmarried and widows. It is good for them if they abide, even as I. It's good. You don't have to get married. It's good to abide. He said to avoid incontinence, to avoid fornication. But if they cannot contain, let them marry. For it's better to marry than to burn. Oh, Paul, come on. Like I say, he's got the perspective of one who is not married and happy. Let's say, well, if it's the choice between burning and marriage, I suppose I'd get married. But he wasn't burning, so he saw no reason to get married. But he knows that for people who do, to burn, he means that figuratively, probably in multiple ways, as far as like to commit fornication, and then to be ultimately, because the lake of fire or the end, the second death is always portrayed as some sort of fiery conflagration, right? So there's that, but also lust is also a form of fiery consuming conflagration, which is another way you can burn. They burn, and he uses this in another place, like in Romans 1, where he says they burn in their lust one towards the other. And it is better to marry than to burn. And to the marry I command, yet not I, but the Lord. This is not by permission. This is by commandment. Let not the wife depart from her husband. Okay, and this goes into another subject. We'll leave this for tomorrow about divorce. So we will pick, because I'm not going to go, we're going to stop at verse 9. We're going to pick up with verse 10. To the married, I command. If you can't contain, then he's saying, don't there's another scripture where he talks about people doing things they shouldn't do in the church. And he says, forbidding to marry. Because some people would almost, like, you get that in the apocalyptic scenarios, where it's like, don't marry, it's time, like in the book of Revelation, right? The 144,000. These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. No, any sect that forbids marriage is wrong. They're wrong to forbid marriage. I understand that in the Catholic Church they have to be a priest you can't be married, but they don't forbid marriage. It's a sacrament, which means it's a holy thing of the faith, and that's fine. But I think they do err, and the error of their choice, because what they did is they set up a caste of people who are regarded as sexually celibate and almost beyond question. Well, the priest is celibate, and he's an authority. So he created these authority positions of trust where it's like, well, this guy doesn't have sex with anybody. And it became a magnet for two kinds of people. It attracts other people, like the genuinely celibate and those who are genuinely minded towards service, okay? There are people who are genuinely minded towards those things, even in that church. But it also attracted another two kinds of people. One, those who are fleeing the lust they know that dwells, the impure desires that they have. They have impure desires for the same sex or children or whatever. They have impure desires, and they think that by becoming a priest they will squash that. That somehow will put an end to that, or that God will help them do that if they become a priest. And then they become one, and they find that they haven't destroyed their desires, and now they're in a position of trust and all that, and becomes a problem. And it also attracts people, another kind, who are not, they're not fleeing their lust. They see it as an opportunity. They're true predators. They see a position of trust and authority where people believe you to be sexually superior. Where the assumption is this is a holy man. And so the man is given a lot of trust around children and such as being, someone committed to absolute celibacy. Well, you would never expect them to be someone who, would molest children, but that's exactly why some of those predators are attracted to those jobs, because it's essentially a job. You don't want a wife. If you don't want a wife but you want a choir boy, the choice between marriage and priesthood is obvious. You know what I mean? It gives you access to children and also trust in the community, a tendency for people to disbelieve accusers, at least it has been for decades and decades and centuries. That, accusing a priest of wrongdoing without proof. How does a child prove anything? Who believes children over a priest? Very diabolical, very wicked. And so, anyways, if you can't contain yourself, marry. All right? And that, like I said, that's for that first group who are like genuinely trying to flee their lust. If you need to flee lust, get married. Because going to the priesthood isn't going to solve your problem. Anyways, so that's the end of that. We'll pick it up with verse 10, essentially. We'll pick it up with verse 10, even though we mentioned it. We'll pick it up in verse 10. Tomorrow, thank you for joining me. And whatever, I almost felt like apologizing for the explicit nature of this study. I should have had a big warning. Warning, content. But I have said nothing for which I am actually ashamed or embarrassed. So, thanks for joining me. Look forward to seeing you or to being seen by you tomorrow. Thanks.
I cried with my whole heart, hear me. O Lord, I will keep thy statutes. I cried unto thee, save me, and I shall keep thy testimonies. I prevented the dawning of the morning. I cried, I hoped in thy word. Mine eyes prevent the night watches, that I might meditate in thy word. Hear my voice according to thy loving kindness, O Lord. Quicken me according to thy judgment they draw nigh, the